Working the night shift at St. Mercy's Hospital was supposed to be easy money, quiet halls, minimal patient interaction, and time to study. As a nursing student, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. But if I had known what the job really entailed, I would have burned my application and never looked back. The interview seemed standard at first, but the supervisor, Mrs. Grayson, closed the blinds halfway through and lowered her voice. "There are certain protocols we follow during the night shift," she said, her tone uncomfortably serious. "If you accept this position, you must adhere to them without question." I nodded, assuming she meant something boring, like making sure the floors stayed clean or ensuring the vending machines were stocked. But when she handed me the list, I felt a strange chill ripple down my spine. 1. Never, under any circumstances, answer room 308 if someone calls for help. 2. The elevator will stop at the basement between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. Do not enter, no matter who you see inside. 3. If the old man in the wheelchair appears near the nurse's station, wheel him to the chapel and leave immediately. Do not look back. 4. The lights in the west wing might flicker. If this happens, find a mirror and stay in its reflection until the lights return. 5. At exactly 4:44 a.m., there will be a knock at the staff room door. Do not open it. Pray until it stops. I thought it was a joke, an elaborate hazing for new staff, but Mrs. Grayson's expression never wavered. Against my better judgment, I took the job. The first night felt normal. The hospital was quiet, almost too quiet, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the occasional beep of a monitor echoed through the halls. I convinced myself the rules were just superstition, something cooked up to keep staff on edge and awake. But as the clock struck 2:07 a.m., the elevator dinged. I froze. It was past visiting hours, and I knew the basement was used only for storage. The doors slid open, and my heart plummeted. Inside stood a woman with long black hair, her back turned to me. She wore a hospital gown that hung limply on her frame. She didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there as though waiting for someone to join her. I gripped the edge of my desk, forcing myself to stay seated. The rule was clear, do not enter. But what if she was a real patient? What if she needed help? "Ma'am, are you okay?" My voice sounded thin, almost shaky. She didn't respond. The elevator doors started to close, but just before they did, her head twitched unnaturally to the side, as if she'd heard me. I caught a glimpse of her face, pale, hollowed out, with eyes that were far too black, like two endless voids. The doors shut. My stomach churned, but I managed to stay put. I hoped that would be the last strange thing I'd encounter that night. I was wrong. At around 3:30 a.m., the West Wing lights began to flicker. My stomach nodded as I remembered rule number 4. A mirror? Where was I supposed to find one? Then I remembered the supply closet near the break room. There was a small mirror on the inside of the door. I sprinted down the dimly lit hallway as the flickering intensified. Shadows danced erratically on the walls, and I swear I saw something, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. When I reached the closet, I yanked the door open and stared into the mirror. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and terrified. The lights flickered faster now, plunging the hallway into darkness every few seconds. In one of those brief moments of darkness, I saw something in the mirror that wasn't there when the lights returned. A shadow stood behind me, towering over my shoulder, its form inhuman. I didn't dare turn around. I just kept my eyes locked on the mirror until the light stabilized. When I finally dared to look back, the hallway was empty. By the time 4:44 a.m. rolled around, I was counting down the minutes to the end of my shift. I had almost convinced myself the worst was over when the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the staff room door. I froze. My breathing hitched as the hairs on my neck stood on end. The knock came again, louder this time, almost insistent. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 4:44 a.m. on the dot. My hands trembled as I whispered a prayer under my breath, clinging to the rules Mrs. Grayson had given me. "Don't open it," I muttered to myself. The knocking continued, growing more frantic. It sounded like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was slamming their fists against the door. I shut my eyes, squeezing them tight as I recited verses from the Quran. Then, Just as suddenly as it began, the knocking stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity before opening my eyes. The silence was deafening. Slowly, I got up and peeked through the tiny window in the door. Nothing. When my shift ended at 7 a.m., I practically sprinted out of the hospital. I considered quitting right then and there, but my curiosity got the better of me. I confronted Mrs. Grayson the next evening before my second shift began. "What is this place?" I demanded. "What's really going on here?" She sighed, her expression weary. St. Mercy's was built on land that, let's just say, it wasn't meant for the living. The hospital sees things during the night that most people can't handle. That's why we have the rules. Who was the woman in the elevator? What was that shadow I saw? Mrs. Grayson didn't answer. She just placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "If you can't follow the rules, this job isn't for you." I still work the night shift at St. Mercy's. The rules haven't changed, and neither have the strange occurrences. Some nights are quiet, but others remind me why the list exists. I've stopped questioning the rules, though. Because I've learned one thing: the moment you break them, you might not live to regret it. I wish I could say I've gotten used to it, that the fear fades with time. But every night, the unease settles in my chest the moment the clock strikes 10 p.m. The hospital's daytime energy is entirely different from its nocturnal state. During the day, it's a place of healing. At night, it feels alive in a way that has nothing to do with medicine or patients. One night, about 3 weeks into the job, I made my first mistake. It was a quiet shift. The kind of quiet that lulls you into complacency. I was doing rounds in the East Wing when I heard a faint, desperate cry for help. It echoed down the hall, coming from room 308. My heart sank. Never, under any circumstances, answer room 308 if someone calls for help. I stood frozen outside the door, my clipboard clutched tightly against my chest. The cries grew louder, more frantic. "Please. Someone help me." The voice was thin and raspy, trembling with pain. I should have walked away. I knew I should have walked away. But I couldn't. I hesitated, then pressed my ear against the door. The cries had turned into sobs. "It hurts," the voice whimpered. "Please don't leave me." My hand hovered over the doorknob. I told myself it might be a real patient, forgotten or ignored. Maybe the rule was outdated. Maybe Mrs. Grayson was exaggerating. I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dark, except for the faint glow of a single monitor. The bed was empty, the sheets pristine. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the voice. Then I saw the shadow. It was in the corner, slumped and unnatural, as though it didn't belong to anything living. The shadow moved, stretching up the wall and spreading like ink spilled in water. I stumbled back, my breath hitching as a cold, suffocating presence filled the room. The door slammed shut behind me. I don't remember much of what happened next. There was a voice, low, guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. The shadow loomed over me, its shape shifting and writhing like it was alive. My knees buckled, and I fell to the floor, unable to breathe, unable to move. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was gone. I woke up in the staff room, my head pounding and my chest tight. Mrs. Grayson was sitting across from me, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly together. "You opened the door, didn't you?" she asked softly. I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. What was that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed me a glass of water and waited until I'd calmed down. "Room 308 isn't empty," she said finally. "It hasn't been empty for years." She explained that, decades ago, a man had been admitted to room 308 after a severe car accident. He died during surgery, but something, his pain, his anger, his fear, had lingered. The room had been closed off, sealed, but whatever was left of him didn't leave. Now, he calls out to the living, desperate to drag someone into his torment. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "Most people who break the rules don't make it out." That night changed everything. I started following the rules to the letter, no matter how absurd or inconvenient they seemed. I ignored the cries, avoided the elevator, and kept my eyes on the mirror whenever the West Wing lights flickered. But the hospital seemed to sense my fear. The strange occurrences grew bolder, more personal. One night, I found my name scrawled on the wall of the break room, written in what looked like dried blood. Another time, the old man in the wheelchair smiled at me as I wheeled him to the chapel, his teeth impossibly sharp. And then there was the night I almost broke completely. It was around 2:45 a.m. when I heard footsteps behind me. I was in the East Wing, checking a patient's chart, when the sound began, soft at first, then louder, echoing in the empty hallway. I turned, expecting to see a doctor or another nurse. Instead, I saw myself. Standing at the end of the hall, illuminated by the faint glow of the exit sign, was me. Same uniform, same tired eyes, same trembling hands. My doppelganger stared at me, her expression blank and emotionless. Then, she smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that didn't belong on my face. She raised a hand and beckoned me forward. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. She began to walk toward me, her movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet on invisible strings. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the staff room. I locked the door, pressed my back against it, and prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. The doppelganger didn't follow, but I could hear faint whispers on the other side of the door. When my shift ended that morning, I handed in my resignation. I never went back to St. Mercy's. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself it was just a bad dream or a trick of an overworked mind. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up to the sound of knocking at my bedroom door. And I don't dare open it. The knocking has become a cruel routine, a nightly reminder that I never truly left St. Mercy's behind. It starts softly, just a gentle tap tap tap. But as the hours stretch on, it grows louder, more insistent, more invasive. Some nights it's accompanied by whispers, low and indecipherable, like 100 voices speaking all at once. I've tried ignoring it. I've tried praying until the first light of dawn. I've even moved apartments, twice. But it always follows me. One night, after weeks of sleepless terror, I broke. The knocking started around 3 a.m., earlier than usual. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of something dragging across the floor outside my bedroom door. I couldn't take it anymore. My fear had boiled over into rage. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For the first time in months, the silence was worse than the sound. My heart raced as I stared at the door, waiting, dreading what might come next. I wanted to believe I'd scared it off, but deep down, I knew better. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the room. It wasn't coming from the other side of the door. It was inside. I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, coiling around themselves like living things. Then, from the corner near my closet, a figure emerged. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The doppelganger stood there, grinning that same twisted grin I'd seen in the hospital. Her eyes were black voids, just like the woman in the elevator. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, her head cocked to the side like she was studying me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there frozen. But my body refused to obey. "I warned you," she finally said, her voice distorted, like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. "You broke the rules." Her grin widened, splitting her face unnaturally as she stepped closer. The next thing I remember, it was morning. I woke up on the floor, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. The door to my bedroom was wide open, though I distinctly remembered locking it before going to bed. Since that night, things have only gotten worse. I see her everywhere now, reflected in windows, in mirrors, in the corners of my vision. She's always watching, always grinning. Sometimes she whispers to me, her voice echoing in my head. "You can't escape," she says. "You brought this on yourself." I've tried everything, burning sage, hiring a priest, even researching ancient rituals online. Nothing works. Last week, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address, no note, just a single item inside, the list of rules from St. Mercy's Hospital. It was slightly different this time. A new rule had been added at the bottom, written in bold, blood-red ink. 6. You can never leave. I don't know what's real anymore. My life has become a waking nightmare, a never-ending shift at a hospital I can't escape. I haven't slept in days, too afraid of what might happen if I close my eyes. If you're reading this, let my story be a warning: never break the rules, no matter how strange or absurd they may seem. Because once you do, they'll never stop following you. And neither will she. I thought I'd reached my breaking point, that nothing could push me further into despair. But last night, everything escalated. It started like all the others, with the knocking. This time, though, it wasn't just at the bedroom door. It came from every wall in the apartment, the sound of fists pounding, shaking the very foundation of my home. The whispers that usually accompanied the knocking were louder now, almost deafening. And then I heard her voice. "Let me in," she said, her words dragging like rusted metal. "You can't keep me out forever." The lights flickered, plunging the room into strobing darkness. In the brief flashes of light, I saw her everywhere, in the mirror, on the ceiling, crawling across the floor. Her grin was wider than ever, splitting her face all the way to her ears. I grabbed my phone and dialed the only person I thought might understand, Mrs. Grayson. It rang 3 times before she answered, her voice groggy but laced with urgency. "You shouldn't have called me," she said, her tone sharp. "It'll only make things worse." "What am I supposed to do?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "She's here. She's everywhere." There was a long pause. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "You need to go back to St. Mercy's." The very thought of returning to that place made my blood run cold, but Mrs. Grayson was insistent. She explained that the hospital was more than just a building, it was a conduit, a place where the line between the living and the dead was thin. By breaking the rules, I'd opened myself up to something far worse than I could comprehend. "If you don't close the door you opened," she said, "she'll follow you forever. And eventually, she'll take you." At 2 a.m., I found myself standing outside St. Mercy's Hospital, the cold night air biting at my skin. The building loomed before me, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of a corpse. The front doors were unlocked, as if the hospital had been expecting me. Inside, the air was heavy, oppressive. The hallways were eerily silent, the fluorescent lights flickering weakly overhead. My footsteps echoed loudly as I made my way to room 308, the list of rules clutched tightly in my hand. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "You can't run forever," her voice echoed from somewhere behind me. I turned, and there she was, standing at the end of the hallway. Her figure was distorted, her limbs too long, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her grin was gone now, replaced by a look of pure, malevolent hunger. I had no choice. I pushed the door to room 308 open and stepped inside. The room was just as I remembered, empty, silent, suffocating. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. The shadow was there, coiled in the corner like a living thing. It rose slowly, stretching across the walls and ceiling, enveloping the room in darkness. "You shouldn't have come back," a voice hissed, low and guttural, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "I'm here to fix this," I said, though my voice trembled. I wanted to stop. The shadow laughed, a sound that made my blood run cold. "You can't fix what's broken. You invited me in, and now you're mine." Suddenly, the darkness surged toward me, cold and heavy, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The air was filled with whispers, thousands of voices speaking all at once, their words incomprehensible but filled with malice. And then, just as I thought it was over, I remembered the list. With the last of my strength, I pulled it from my pocket and held it up. I followed the rules. I screamed. "You can't take me." The whispers stopped. The darkness recoiled, writhing and twisting like a wounded animal. The shadow let out a deafening roar, and then, suddenly, it was gone. I woke up on the floor of the hospital hallway, the morning sun streaming through the windows. The air was light again, the oppressive weight lifted. But I knew it wasn't over. When I returned home, my apartment was empty, quiet. Too quiet. The knocking had stopped, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night. But deep down, I knew she was still out there, waiting. And every time I pass a mirror or walk through a dark hallway, I can feel her watching me. I followed the rules. But some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. The days passed in uneasy calm. The knocking had ceased, and the air in my apartment felt lighter, as though I'd been freed from an invisible chain. Yet, the paranoia lingered. Every creak in the floorboards, every shadow out of place, sent my heart racing. I knew she was still out there, waiting for me to slip. But I refused to let fear consume me. I needed answers, closure, something to make sense of this nightmare. One evening, I visited Mrs. Grayson. She greeted me at her modest home, her face etched with worry. "You shouldn't have come," she warned, but her voice carried the weight of resignation. "I need to know," I said, gripping the list of rules. "What is she, and why did St. Mercy's choose me?" She sighed deeply, motioning for me to sit. "St. Mercy's isn't just a hospital," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a place where the veil between life and death is thinner than anywhere else. The rules were created to keep the living safe from them. Those who linger between worlds. And the shadow. The woman." I pressed. "They're echoes of what once was," she said, her gaze distant. "The woman you saw, she broke the rules long before you ever worked there. She thought she could cheat death, but it consumed her. Now, she exists as a warden, bound to enforce the rules she once ignored. And you." She hesitated, as if reluctant to continue. "What about me?" I urged. "You were chosen because you're sensitive to the unseen. They saw you as a perfect candidate, a watcher, someone who could follow the rules without question." She paused, her expression darkening. "But when you broke the rules, even unknowingly, you opened a door to her world. She saw your fear, your doubt, and latched on." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. "Is there a way to stop her? For good?" Mrs. Grayson hesitated again before finally speaking. "There is one way. But it's dangerous. You'd have to confront her, not in this world, but in hers." That night, I prepared myself. Mrs. Grayson gave me an old ritual, one that would allow me to step into her realm and face her directly. "You'll only have one chance," she warned. "You must banish her completely, or you'll be trapped there forever." I followed the instructions meticulously, lighting the candles and reciting the incantation. As the final words left my lips, the air around me grew cold, and the room dissolved into darkness. I found myself in a warped version of St. Mercy's Hospital. The walls were cracked, oozing with a dark, tar-like substance. The lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. And there she was, standing at the end of the hallway, her twisted grin wider than ever. "You came back," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I lied, stepping forward. "This ends now." She laughed, a guttural, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the halls. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but a pawn in a game you don't understand." But I wasn't the same person who'd cowered in fear for months. I pulled out the list of rules, now marked with strange symbols Mrs. Grayson had given me. Holding it up, I recited the banishment chant she'd taught me. The woman screamed, her form twisting and contorting as the words filled the air. The shadows around her writhed, reaching out toward me, but the symbols on the list glowed with an otherworldly light, pushing them back. With one final, ear-piercing scream, she exploded into a cloud of black mist that dissipated into nothingness. I woke up in my apartment, the list of rules crumpled in my hand. The candles had burned out, leaving only the faint scent of wax. For the first time in months, the air felt normal. The knocking never returned. The mirrors were just mirrors. And the shadows no longer held secrets. I'd finally closed the door. St. Mercy's Hospital remains open, and I'm sure the rules are still in place, guarding against those who dare to break them. I've moved on, left the night shift behind, and started a new life far from that cursed place. But every now and then, when I catch a shadow out of the corner of my eye or hear an unexpected knock, I'm reminded of her. And I remind myself, some rules aren't meant to be broken. Because the cost of disobedience isn't just death, it's something far worse.